In my experience, the most dangerous crimes are not committed in haste, but in calm. The hurried man makes mistakes. The frightened man leaves traces, but the methodical man, he prepares. When a message accuses the living of murder, we must first ask a simpler question. How does a dead man speak? Lionel Brooke was a careful man. Dates mattered to him. Order mattered. This letter was posted on the 14th of October. He was buried on the 16th. And yet, the letter arrived on the 17th. The postmark shows he mailed it after he was dead.
Welcome to Cafe Stories. Tonight's case is one of the most unusual we've encountered. A respected solicitor dies of what appears to be natural causes, only for a letter to arrive the next morning, calmly declaring that he has been murdered. There is no accusation, no hysteria, no plea for help, just certainty. And that certainty is what makes the case so deeply unsettling. You may notice that we've made a few changes in how our mysteries are presented. We're refining the experience and shaping each episode to feel more immersive and thoughtful. I hope you enjoy this new direction. If you enjoy Cafe Stories and would like to support our work, you can do so through Patreon. The link is in the description. Now, as always, grab a coffee, stay curious, and let's get started. A Letter from the Dead. Chapter 1. The Impossible Correspondence. The telephone rang at 9:30 on a Thursday morning, whilst Poirot was arranging his collection of miniature porcelain figurines. He had been at it since breakfast, adjusting each piece with minute precision until the display achieved what he considered perfect symmetry. The jangling instrument disturbed this meditation, and he crossed to it with visible reluctance. "Allo?" I watched his expression shift from irritation to interest in the space of perhaps 30 seconds. He murmured brief responses, then replaced the receiver with unusual care. That was our good friend Jap Hastings. He requests our presence at Scotland Yard within the hour. What's happened? He declines to say over the telephone, but his voice, it had a quality most curious. Poirot tilted his head, like a man who has witnessed something that contradicts the natural order. Within 40 minutes we stood in Jap's office. The inspector had aged since I had last seen him, though perhaps it was merely the grey light filtering through the window that lent his face that worn appearance. He gestured us to chairs without the usual pleasantries. "I'll show you first, then explain after." He withdrew a single sheet of paper from his desk drawer and placed it before Poirot. I leaned forward to read the typed message. "To the Metropolitan Police. If you are reading this, then I have been murdered. I cannot say by whom, but I have arranged for this letter to reach you after my death. The circumstances will appear natural. They are not. I trust you will investigate thoroughly. Lionel Brooke, solicitor, Weatherby on Avon." The silence that followed held weight. When did this arrive? Poirot's fingers hovered over the paper without touching it. "Tuesday morning. Posted on the 14th of October from Weatherby on Avon." Jap slid the envelope across. "Lionel Brooke was buried the day before it arrived. Heart failure, according to the death certificate. Natural causes. No suspicion, no investigation. The local police saw no reason to question it until this letter appeared." "Precisely." Poirot lifted the envelope to examine the postmark. His eyes narrowed. "Posted at 3:45 in the afternoon on the 14th. And the death occurred when?" "That's where it becomes interesting." Jap consulted his notebook. "The doctor who certified the death, a Martin Elwood, family physician for years, placed it at approximately 4:30 that afternoon. Brooke was found in his study by his secretary when she returned from running errands, stone dead in his chair. The letter bears a date, I observed, the same day as his death. Written that morning, one presumes. Japp frowned. Though how a dead man manages to post a letter 15 minutes after dying is beyond my understanding. Someone else posted it, I said. Poirot raised one finger. Perhaps other explanations exist. He studied the typewritten lines. This Monsieur Brooke, what manner of man was he? Respected solicitor, 63 years old, lived quietly with his wife and son in a Georgian house on the edge of town. No scandals, no enemies that anyone knew of. Japp tapped the letter. Which is why the local constabulary think this is nonsense. An old man's paranoia, perhaps penned weeks or months ago and posted by accident after his death. But you, mon ami, you do not believe this. I don't know what to believe, that's why I've called you. Japp met Poirot's gaze. The thing reads like bad melodrama, yet something about it troubles me. The certainty, Poirot murmured. Beg pardon? The tone of the letter. There is no hysteria, no appeal for help, no accusation. Simply a statement of fact delivered with the confidence of a man leaving instructions for his executor. Poirot tapped the paper. If this were the product of a disordered mind, we would see different language, no? Fear, perhaps, confusion. But this is the voice of a methodical intelligence making preparations. Japp shifted in his chair. So you'll go to Wetherby-on-Avon? We shall take the afternoon train. Poirot rose, still holding the letter. With your permission, I will retain this and the envelope. They may reveal more upon closer examination. Take them with my blessing. The local inspector is a man named Marsh. I've wired him to expect you, though he's made it clear he considers this a fool's errand. That is often the case with the truth, my friend. It appears foolish until the moment it reveals itself as inevitable. We departed Scotland Yard and walked through streets still damp from the previous night's rain. Poirot said nothing until we had turned onto our own road. You are troubled, Hastings? I see it in your face. The whole business seems fantastic. A man predicts his own murder, then dies of natural causes. It makes no sense. Ah, but that is where you are wrong, mon ami. Poirot paused at our doorstep. It makes perfect sense, if one accepts that what appears natural may be the most unnatural thing of all. He disappeared inside, leaving me to contemplate this cryptic observation. The letter, with its calm declaration of murder, had cast a shadow over the morning. I could not shake the image of a man sitting at his typewriter, composing his own epitaph with the dispassion of one drafting a business contract. Whatever waited for us in Wetherby-on-Avon, I sensed it would prove far stranger than the letter itself. Chapter 2. Brooke House. The train carried us through countryside that grew progressively more rural as London receded behind us. Poirot spent the journey examining the letter and envelope through a small magnifying glass he produced from his waistcoat pocket, murmuring occasionally in French. I attempted conversation twice and abandoned the effort after receiving only absent responses. Wetherby-on-Avon proved to be a market town of moderate size, its high street lined with shops that had likely stood unchanged for generations. A taxi conveyed us to Brooke House, which sat at the edge of town where cultivated gardens gave way to open fields. The building itself was Georgian, handsome in its proportions, with that air of settled prosperity one associates with the professional classes. A maid admitted us to a drawing-room where Mrs. Helena Brooke awaited our arrival. She rose as we entered, a woman perhaps 58 or 60, dressed in black that emphasized the pallor of her complexion. Her hands moved constantly, smoothing her skirt, adjusting a cushion, touching the pearls at her throat. "Mr. Poirot? Captain Hastings?" Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "Inspector Marsh telephoned to say you were coming, though I confess I don't understand why Scotland Yard takes an interest in my husband's death. Dr. Elwood was quite certain it was his heart." "Madame, we shall endeavour not to intrude upon your grief more than necessary." Poirot inclined his head. "Perhaps you would permit me to ask a few questions?" "Of course. Please, sit." We arranged ourselves, and Poirot leaned forward with that particular intensity he employed when observation mattered more than words. "Your husband, madam. In the days before his death, did you notice anything unusual in his manner? Any change in his habits or disposition?" "Lionel was always even-tempered. He kept regular hours, attended to his clients, came home for supper." She paused. "Though now you mention it, he seemed preoccupied these last few weeks. Distracted, perhaps, but he never confided the cause. He said nothing of concern, no troubles at his practice. He never discussed his work with me. He felt it would be a breach of confidence." The door opened, and a young man entered with the careless confidence of one accustomed to interrupting. He was perhaps 30, fair-haired and handsome in a dissolute fashion that suggested late nights and poor decisions. "Mother, I've just spoken to—" He stopped upon seeing us. "Oh, I beg your pardon, I didn't realize we had visitors." "This is my son, Gerald." Mrs. Brooke's voice carried a note of apology. "Mr. Poirot and Captain Hastings have come from London regarding your father's death." "From London?" Gerald's eyebrows rose. "Good Lord, surely there's been some mistake. The doctor said father's heart simply gave out. These things happen. Nevertheless, certain questions have arisen that require clarification." Poirot studied the younger man. "You were here when your father died?" "I was in town, returned around 5:15 to find the house in an uproar." He moved to the window, jingling coins in his pocket. "Terrible shock, naturally. Father seemed perfectly well at breakfast that morning." "You spoke with him then?" "Briefly. He asked about my plans for the day. I mentioned an appointment with my tailor. Nothing of consequence." A knock interrupted us, and the maid re-entered. "Excuse me, ma'am, but Miss Hale asks if she might join you. She's heard the gentlemen have arrived from London." "Of course. Send her in." The woman who entered moved with the precision of a military officer conducting an inspection. She was perhaps 45, thin and upright, dressed in grey that matched the severity of her expression, her eyes fixed on Poirot with unmistakable intelligence. "Miss Prudence Hale." She offered no hand, merely a curt nod. "I was Mr. Brooke's secretary for 18 years. I understand you've been engaged to investigate his death, though I cannot imagine on what grounds." "We investigate nothing as yet, mademoiselle. We merely seek to understand the circumstances." "The circumstances were straightforward. I served Mr. Brooke his afternoon tea at 4:10. He was alive and working at his desk. I left to post some letters and collect items from the chemist. When I returned, shortly before 5, I found him dead in his chair." She delivered these facts as though reading from a report. Dr. Elwood arrived within 10 minutes and certified that Mr. Brooke's heart had failed. There was nothing suspicious, nothing unusual. "You posted letters, you say? At what time precisely?" "I left the house at approximately 4:20. The post office is a 5-minute walk." "And you posted several letters?" 3 or 4, I believe. Routine correspondence." Poirot's fingers drummed once against his knee, the only outward sign of interest. "The tea you brought to Monsieur Brooke, you prepared it yourself?" "Cook prepared the tray. I merely carried it to the study." Her tone suggested impatience with these minutiae. "Mr. Brooke took his tea with milk, no sugar, the same every afternoon for 18 years. The study remains as it was. Largely unchanged. Mrs. Brooke felt it improper to disturb anything." Then perhaps, madame, you would permit me to view the room?" Poirot addressed Mrs. Brooke, who nodded weakly. Miss Hale led us down a corridor to a door at the rear of the house. The study beyond held that peculiar stillness of rooms where death has recently called. A large desk dominated the space, its surface neat save for a leather blotter and an empty teacup resting on a small tray. Poirot moved to the desk with the care of a man entering sacred ground. He examined the cup, peered at the blotter, then opened the desk drawers one by one. A typewriter sat on a side table, its keys clean and well maintained. "This machine, Miss Hale, Mr. Brooke used it himself." "For personal correspondence only. I handled all professional typing." "And the ribbon was changed recently, no?" Her hesitation lasted perhaps 2 seconds. "The day he died, actually. The old one had become faint. I replaced it that afternoon whilst he was resting." "Most convenient." Something in Poirot's tone made her stiffen, but she said nothing. He crossed to examine a calendar on the desk, its pages still turned to October 14th. One entry caught my eye. "P.H. 4:30, written in a small, precise hand. "This appointment," I said. "Did it take place?" "Mr. Brooke cancelled all appointments that afternoon. He felt unwell after lunch." Miss Hale's voice remained level, but her hands had clasped together at her waist. He asked not to be disturbed. "Yet you brought him tea at 4:10? "He always took tea at that hour. I saw no reason to deviate from routine." Poirot turned from the calendar, his green eyes thoughtful. "Thank you, mademoiselle. You have been most helpful." We returned to the drawing-room where Mrs. Brooke and Gerald waited. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the carpet. Poirot stood silent for a moment, his gaze distant. "We shall trouble you no further today, madame, but with your permission we will take rooms in the town and continue our inquiries tomorrow." "Of course, Mr. Poirot, whatever you think necessary." As we departed, I glanced back at the house. 3 faces watched from separate windows: Mrs. Brooke, Gerald, and Miss Hale. Each wore an expression I could not quite decipher, but which left me with a distinct impression of secrets waiting just beneath the surface of ordinary courtesy. The trap that carried us to the inn moved slowly through the gathering dusk, and I found myself thinking of that empty teacup and the calendar notation that had never been explained. Chapter 3. The Methodical Mind. The Swan Inn provided adequate if unremarkable accommodation. We dined in a low-ceilinged room where the proprietor's wife served us roast mutton and potatoes, whilst offering unsolicited observations about the weather. Poirot ate sparingly, his attention fixed on some interior landscape I could not penetrate. "You're troubled by something?" I ventured, when the woman had finally retreated to her kitchen. "I am troubled by many things, Hastings, but chief among them is the question of why." He set down his fork with precision. "A man arranges for a letter to reach the police after his death. He knows he will be murdered, yet he takes no steps to prevent it. He does not flee, does not seek protection, does not even name his killer. Why? Perhaps he didn't know who would kill him. Then how did he know he would be killed at all?" Poirot shook his head. "No, mon ami, there is something we do not yet see, something in the character of Lionel Brooke that explains this strange passivity." The following morning brought clearer weather. We returned to Brooke House to find Dr. Elwood had called at Poirot's request. He waited in the drawing-room, a man of perhaps 60, with the comfortable bulk of one who has spent decades advising others to take better care of themselves. "Mr. Poirot." He extended a hand. "I confess myself baffled by this entire business. Lionel Brooke died of heart failure. I've known the man 20 years, treated him for various minor complaints. His heart was not strong. You had warned him of this? On several occasions, I urged him to reduce his workload, take more exercise. He promised to consider it, but changed nothing. Elwood settled into a chair that creaked under his weight. The morning he died, I saw him at his office. He'd requested a brief consultation. Indeed? And the nature of this consultation? He asked about symptoms of poisoning. The doctor's voice carried a note of defensive challenge. Specifically substances that might mimic natural death. Poirot's eyebrows lifted a fraction. A curious inquiry. I thought so at the time, asked if he suspected someone had been poisoned. He said no, merely researching for a client's case. Elwood's hands gripped his knees. You see why I mention it now? Given this damned letter, it seems Brooks suspected something might happen to him. Yet you found no evidence of poisoning when you examined the body? I wasn't looking for it. The man had a weak heart. He was found dead in his chair. There were no signs of violence or struggle. Heart failure was the obvious conclusion. His voice rose slightly. If you're suggesting I was negligent, I suggest nothing, Doctor. I merely seek to understand. Poirot's tone remained mild. This meeting at his office, what time did it occur? 11 o'clock? He seemed perfectly composed, if perhaps more serious than usual. And you saw him again that day? No, I was attending patients until evening. Heard about his death from my housekeeper when I returned home around 6. After Elwood departed, Poirot requested permission to examine Brooks' office in town. Mrs. Brooke provided a key with visible reluctance, and we walked the half-mile to the high street where Brooke had maintained his practice above a stationer's shop. The office held the austere quality of a man who valued function over comfort. A desk, 2 chairs, filing cabinets lining one wall. Everything meticulously organized, each document in its proper place. Poirot moved through the space like a careful thief, opening drawers, examining papers, his fingers light and quick. Hastings, regard this. He held up a letter addressed to a private investigator in London, dated 3 weeks prior. The contents were brief but pointed. Brooke requested surveillance of his own household, specifically regarding financial irregularities that required discreet verification. Good heavens, he suspected someone was stealing from him? From his clients, perhaps. A solicitor holds funds in trust, non? Money that passes through his hands but belongs to others. Poirot continued searching, producing several more letters. And here, correspondence with the investigator. He reported findings but died in a motoring accident on the 1st of October. That's less than 2 weeks before Brooks' own death. Precisely. Most convenient for someone, n'est-ce pas? The implication settled between us like a cold draught. Poirot pocketed the letters and turned to the filing cabinets, working through them with methodical patience. An hour passed before he made a small sound of satisfaction. Come, Hastings, look at these client files. He had spread several folders across the desk. Each contained records of trust funds, estates held for children until their majority, inheritances managed during probate, that sort of thing. The figures were substantial. Notice anything curious? I studied the documents but saw only columns of numbers and dates. They appear perfectly in order. Exactly so. Too perfectly. His finger traced down one page. Every entry balanced, every withdrawal documented, every deposit recorded. The work of someone most meticulous. Miss Hale managed these accounts? I believe so. Her signature appears on many of the transaction records. He gathered the folders. But I wonder what the investigator discovered before his unfortunate accident, and whether Lionel Brooke confronted anyone with those discoveries. We returned to the inn for lunch, where Poirot composed a telegram to Scotland Yard requesting information about the deceased investigator. The reply arrived within 2 hours. The accident had occurred on a country road. No witnesses. The man's motor car found at the bottom of an embankment. Death ruled accidental. "You don't believe that," I said. "I believe nothing yet. But I observe that 2 men who might have exposed a thief are now dead, both under circumstances deemed natural or accidental." Poirot drummed his fingers against the table. "We must speak again with Miss Hale." We found her at Brooke House, in a small office adjacent to the study. She sat at a desk covered with papers, a pen moving across them with mechanical regularity. She looked up at our entrance without surprise. "Mr. Poirot, more questions?" "If you would be so kind, mademoiselle. We have been examining Mr. Brooke's files in town. Most impressive, the organization. Your work, I presume?" "Mr. Brooke entrusted me with maintaining the client accounts. I've done so for 18 years without complaint." "Of course. And the private investigator Mr. Brooke engaged last month, did you know of this?" Her pen stopped. The silence stretched for several heartbeats. "I knew he had employed someone. He didn't discuss the reasons." "He never mentioned financial irregularities?" "Mr. Brooke shared very little with me regarding such matters." Her voice had acquired an edge. "If you're suggesting I had something to do with his death, I suggest nothing. I merely establish facts." Poirot smiled, but the expression held no warmth. "The day Mr. Brooke died, you said he cancelled his afternoon appointments, yet his calendar showed an entry for 4:30. The initials P.H. I've no idea what that referred to. Perhaps he meant to write something and forgot." "In his own hand, on the morning of his death?" Poirot tilted his head. "A most remarkable coincidence, that he would forget an appointment with the same initials as your name." Miss Hale rose from her chair, her composure cracking like ice over warming water. "I've answered your questions, Mr. Poirot. If you'll excuse me, I have work to complete." She swept from the room, leaving us amid the ordered papers and filing cabinets. Poirot stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the doorway through which she had departed. "Well," I said. That touched a nerve. "Indeed, Hastings, indeed it did." He turned to me, and something in his expression suggested satisfaction. "The truth, it begins to show itself, but we must have proof, not merely suspicion. And for that we require the services of a chemist." He would say no more, leaving me to puzzle over what connection might exist between a dead solicitor, his efficient secretary, and a letter that had somehow posted itself after murder. Chapter 4. The Calendar Entry. That evening we dined with Samuel Croft, the distant cousin who had been staying at Brooke House when the death occurred. He met us at a small restaurant near the market square, a lean man in his middle 40s, whose clothes suggested neither poverty nor prosperity, but rather a careful existence somewhere between the two. "I appreciate your agreeing to speak with us," Poirot began once we had ordered. "You were visiting your cousin when he died?" "Visiting is perhaps too strong a word. I'd come on business." Croft stirred his soup without enthusiasm. "Lionel and I shared a great-uncle who left some property in Derbyshire. Disputed boundaries with a neighbour. Lionel handled the legal matters, but he wanted my opinion on whether we should sell or settle." "You arrived when?" "The 12th of October, 2 days before he died." Croft set down his spoon. I barely knew the man, truth be told. We'd exchanged perhaps a dozen letters in as many years. When he invited me to stay, I thought it an opportunity to strengthen family ties. Instead, I found myself in the middle of a household that barely spoke to one another. "How do you mean?" "Gerald avoided his father unless money was discussed. Miss Hale moved through the house like a ghost, always working, never socializing. Helena, Mrs. Brooke, seemed frightened of her own shadow. He paused. And Lionel himself was distracted. Pleasant enough, but his mind was clearly elsewhere. Did he mention what troubled him? Not directly, but I overheard him speaking to Miss Hale the afternoon before he died. I was in the corridor outside his study. The door was ajar. Poirot leaned forward slightly. And what did you hear? Lionel said something about needing to speak with her at 4:30 the following day. She asked if it could wait until the next week. He said no, it had waited long enough. Croft met Poirot's gaze. His tone was cold, not at all his usual manner. And Miss Hale's response? She agreed to the meeting. Then she left the study, saw me in the corridor, and hurried past without a word, looked pale as milk. Yet she told us Mr. Brooke cancelled all appointments that afternoon. Did she? Croft's eyebrows rose. That's a curious claim, given what I heard. We walked back to the inn, through streets empty, save for the occasional cat slinking between shadows. Poirot's silence had the quality of a mind working through a complex calculation, and I knew better than to interrupt his thoughts. The following morning brought a telegram from London. Poirot read it, then passed it to me without comment. Inspector Marsh had preserved the teacup and sent it to London for analysis on our first day in Wetherby-on-Avon. The message confirmed that residue from the teacup had been tested and contained traces of a rare alkaloid compound, one that induced symptoms identical to heart failure and left minimal evidence. Good Lord, I breathed, but then he was murdered. As we suspected, but proof and suspicion are different animals, Hastings. We must now establish not merely that he was poisoned, but by whom and how. We returned to Brooke House to find the household in varying states of distress. News of the poison had reached them through Inspector Marsh, who had informed Mrs. Brooke that morning. She received us in the drawing-room, her hands trembling. As she poured tea, she immediately forgot to drink. I cannot comprehend it. Poison. Who would do such a thing? Gerald paced before the fireplace, his earlier insouciance replaced by visible agitation. The police are treating this as murder now. They've questioned all of us separately. Mother's been made ill by the whole business. And Miss Hale? Poirot inquired. Locked in her office, refuses to speak to anyone. He stopped pacing. Look here, Mr. Poirot, if someone killed my father, you must find them. But surely you don't suspect anyone in this household. I suspect everyone until I know the truth, monsieur. It is the only way to eliminate the innocent and identify the guilty. Dr. Elwood arrived shortly thereafter, summoned by Mrs. Brooke's distress. He examined her briefly, prescribed rest, then confronted Poirot in the hallway with barely contained anger. I've been made to look a fool. The police suggest I should have detected the poisoning. No one suggests foolishness, Doctor. You diagnosed based on reasonable evidence. The killer depended upon that very reasonableness. Who could have done it? Who had access to Brooke's tea that afternoon? That is what we must determine. Poirot gestured toward the study. Walk me through the afternoon again. Miss Hale brought the tea at 4:10. Where was everyone else? Gerald was in town, I believe. Mrs. Brooke was resting in her room. She always lies down after lunch. Samuel Croft had gone for a walk. Elwood rubbed his temples. Miss Hale was the only person who saw Lionel alive after 3 o'clock. And the tea was prepared by the cook? So Miss Hale claimed. We found the cook in the kitchen, a stout woman named Mrs. Dockery, who had worked for the Brookes for 15 years. She confirmed preparing the tea tray that afternoon: pot, cup, milk jug, sugar bowl, and a small plate of biscuits. Miss Hale collected it herself at 4:10. I asked if Mr. Brooke wanted anything with his tea, but she said just the biscuits as usual. The tray remained in your sight until Miss Hale took it? Not the entire time. I had to fetch milk from the pantry, but it was only for a moment. Poirot examined the kitchen with the thoroughness of a man conducting inventory. He opened cupboards, peered into the pantry, inspected the tea caddy and sugar tin. Finally he straightened, his expression thoughtful. "Mrs. Dockery, did anyone else enter the kitchen that afternoon?" Miss Hale came through twice. Once to collect the tray, and again later to return it. She washed the cup herself, said she didn't want me troubled with extra work. She washed it immediately, within minutes of finding Mr. Brooke dead. Said she couldn't bear to leave it sitting there with his tea gone cold. Mrs. Dockery's voice wavered. I thought it strange at the time, washing up when a man had just died, but Miss Hale was always particular about such things. We left the kitchen and returned to the study. Poirot stood before the desk calendar, staring at the notation P.H. 4:30, as though it might suddenly speak. "She cancelled the meeting," I said, "by killing him before it could take place." "Perhaps. But consider the timing, Hastings. If she poisoned the tea, when did she do so? The cook prepared the tray. Miss Hale collected it at 4:10 and brought it directly to the study. She claims to have left immediately for her errands, yet she was seen at the post office at 4:15, only 35 minutes later. Then she could have poisoned the tea in the study before leaving. Possible. But that requires Brooke to drink poisoned tea while she stood there, then wait for him to die, then leave for the post office at exactly the right moment to post the letter he had supposedly written that morning. Poirot shook his head. The sequence troubles me. There are too many elements that must align perfectly. Unless she didn't leave immediately. Perhaps she waited to ensure he was dead. Then how did she arrive at the post office by 4:15? And why post the letter at all? If she had poisoned him and wished to make it appear natural, the letter only draws attention to murder. The question hung between us like smoke. Miss Hale had the opportunity, the means, and, if the embezzlement theory proved correct, the motive. Yet something in the mechanics of the crime did not quite fit. Poirot crossed to the window and gazed out at the garden, where autumn had begun its work of dismantling summer's growth. "There is a piece missing, mon ami. Something we have not yet seen. Until we find it, we cannot complete the picture." He turned to face me. "But I think perhaps it is time to speak with Miss Hale again, and this time we shall ask about the typewriter ribbon." His tone carried that particular note of satisfaction that indicated he had perceived something I had entirely missed. Chapter 5. The Pattern Emerges. Miss Hale's office door remained locked. Poirot knocked 3 times before her voice emerged, muffled and strained. "I've nothing more to say." "Then you will listen, mademoiselle, while I speak, for I have much to tell you." Silence. Then the sound of a key turning. The door opened to reveal Miss Hale's face, pale and drawn, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. She stood aside without a word, and we entered the small room where papers lay scattered across the desk in uncharacteristic disorder. "You have heard about the poison," Poirot said. "Inspector Marsh informed me. He believes I murdered Mr. Brooke." Her voice carried neither protest nor fear, only a terrible weariness. "He asked about the tea, the timing, my movements that afternoon. Everything points to me. The evidence is most suggestive, this is true, but I am curious about one detail, the typewriter ribbon." Her hands clenched. "I told you, it needed replacing." "On that particular day, the very day your employer died?" Poirot moved to examine the typewriter in the study, visible through the open doorway. "Most convenient timing, or perhaps most necessary timing?" "I don't understand what you're suggesting." "I think you do, mademoiselle. A ribbon preserves an impression of every letter typed upon it. An old ribbon, examined carefully, might reveal what documents were recently produced. He turned to face her. Documents such as, perhaps, a letter claiming murder? The colour drained from her face entirely. You typed the letter, Poirot continued, his voice gentle but implacable. Not Monsieur Brooke. You. That is why you replaced the ribbon that afternoon, to destroy the evidence of your work. But you made one error. You posted the letter too late. Miss Hale sank into her chair. Her hands lay flat on the desk, like pale birds that had forgotten how to fly. How did you know? The postmark, 3:45 in the afternoon, but Monsieur Brooke was found dead at 5 o'clock, no? The doctor placed his death at approximately 4:30. Either a dead man walked to the post office, or someone else posted that letter after he had died. Poirot's green eyes held hers. You were seen at the post office at approximately 4:20, posting household correspondence, you claimed, but among those letters was one that should have been impossible, a letter from a dead man. You cannot prove I posted it. Perhaps not in a court of law, but combined with the replaced typewriter ribbon, your lie about the cancelled meeting, your washing of the teacup within moments of finding the body, these things create a pattern most damning. I had been watching her face throughout this exchange, and what I saw there was not the expression of a cornered murderess, but something more complex. Fear, certainly, but also a desperate confusion, as though the accusation touched upon something she had not anticipated. "I didn't kill him," she said finally. "God help me, I didn't kill him." "Yet you typed the letter." "Yes." The word emerged barely above a whisper. "And posted it after his death." "Yes." "Why?" She looked up at Poirot, and in her eyes I saw the calculation of a woman choosing between truths. "Because I was terrified. He discovered what I'd done, the money I'd taken from the client accounts over the years. Small amounts at first, then larger. He'd hired an investigator. And when that man died, I thought perhaps I was safe. But Lionel called me into his study the day before he died. Said we needed to speak the following afternoon at 4:30. I knew what that meant. So you poisoned his tea." "No." The denial cracked like a whip. "I would have confessed, faced the consequences, but I didn't kill him." "Then explain the letter, mademoiselle. If you did not murder him, why did you post a letter accusing someone of his murder?" Miss Hale's hands twisted together. "I'd written it weeks ago. After the investigator died, I became paranoid. Thought perhaps someone meant to kill Lionel and blame me for it. The embezzlement would provide motive. So I typed the letter on his machine, imitating his style. If he died suspiciously, the letter would point to murder and perhaps take suspicion away from me. A form of insurance. I kept it in my desk. The morning he died, I brought it with me to the study, intending to destroy it. But when I found him dead in his chair, I panicked. The 4:30 meeting would never happen. No one would discover the embezzlement. His death looked natural. But if questions were raised later, if somehow the theft was discovered, everyone would assume I'd killed him to avoid exposure." She drew a shaking breath. "So I posted the letter. Let them think murder. Let them investigate everyone. Better that than having them discover my theft and assume I'd poisoned him. I thought—" her voice broke. "I thought the investigation would focus elsewhere. On Gerald, with his debts, perhaps, or on someone outside the household. Anyone but me." Poirot regarded her with an expression I could not decipher. "A most desperate gamble, mademoiselle, for in posting that letter you drew attention to the very crime you sought to conceal. I know that now, but in that moment, with him dead in his chair and the meeting cancelled, all I could think was that I had to protect myself. I had to make it look as though someone else had reason to kill him. Yet someone did have reason. Someone did kill him." Poirot's voice sharpened. "If you did not poison the tea, then who did?" "I don't know. When I brought the tray to the study, he was alive and well, working at his desk." I set down the tray and left immediately for my errands. I went to the chemist first, then to the post office. I was gone perhaps 45 minutes. When I returned, I found him exactly as he was when I'd left him, except dead. You did not give him the tea? I left it on the tray. He always preferred to pour it himself. Let it steep to the strength he wanted. Poirot began pacing the small office, his hands clasped behind his back. So the tea arrives at 4:10. You leave immediately, return at 5 o'clock to find him dead, but the poison was in the tea. This the laboratory has confirmed. Therefore, either you poisoned it before bringing the tray, or someone else entered the study after you departed. The study door was closed when I left. I assumed he wanted privacy to work. And the house? Who else was present? Mrs. Brooke was in her room. Gerald had gone to town. Mr. Croft was walking in the garden, I believe. Dr. Elwood had departed after his morning visit. The servants? Mrs. Dockery in the kitchen. The maid was upstairs making beds. Poirot stopped pacing and fixed Miss Hale with a penetrating stare. Think carefully, mademoiselle. When you collected the tea tray from the kitchen, did you observe anything unusual? Any disturbance? Any person who should not have been there? She closed her eyes, clearly forcing her memory back to that afternoon. The kitchen was warm. Mrs. Dockery had been baking. The tray was ready on the table where she always prepared it. I carried it down the corridor to the study. Her eyes opened. Wait, there was something. The door to the servants' passage was ajar. It's usually kept closed, but that afternoon it stood open perhaps 6 inches. The passage leads where? To the back stairs. They access all floors of the house without passing through the main corridors. Poirot's expression shifted, became intent. Anyone could have used those stairs to reach the ground floor unobserved? Yes, the family rarely uses that passage, but it's not locked. Hastings. Poirot turned to me with sudden energy. We must speak again with each member of this household, and this time we ask not where they were, but how they moved through the house that afternoon. He strode from the office, leaving Miss Hale sitting amid her scattered papers, like a general surveying a lost battlefield. As we descended the main staircase, Poirot spoke without looking at me. She did not kill him, mon ami, of this I am now certain. But she admitted to the letter, to the embezzlement. Yes, yes, all this is true, but a woman who has just poisoned a man does not wash his teacup and post a letter drawing attention to murder. She runs, or she stays silent, and hopes the death passes unquestioned. He paused at the bottom of the stairs. No, Miss Hale is a thief and a fool, but she is not our killer. Someone else entered that study. Someone who knew the poison would mimic heart failure. Someone who moved through this house like a ghost. The afternoon light slanting through the windows seemed suddenly cold, and I found myself glancing at the shadows gathering in corners, wondering what other secrets this house concealed. Chapter 6. The Truth Assembled. Poirot requested that all members of the household gather in the drawing-room at 6 o'clock. Inspector Marsh arrived from the village station, his face bearing the harried expression of a man who had spent the afternoon receiving contradictory statements. The autumn dusk pressed against the windows as we assembled. Mrs. Brooke on the sofa, Gerald standing by the fireplace, Dr. Elwood in the corner chair, Samuel Croft near the door, and Miss Hale seated apart from the others, her face a mask of resignation. Poirot stood before them, his hands clasped behind his back, his manner grave. I have asked you here to explain the death of Lionel Brooke. Some of what I say will distress you. For that, I apologize. But the truth demands hearing, regardless of the pain it causes. Mrs. Brooke's hands fluttered to her throat. You know who killed my husband? I know, madam, but first, permit me to reconstruct the events of October 14th. A murder, you comprehend, is like a puzzle. Each piece must fit precisely, or the picture remains incomplete. He began to pace, his voice measured and clear. That morning, Lionel Brooke typed a letter, or so we believed. In truth, the letter was typed weeks earlier by Miss Hale, who had discovered her employer suspected her of embezzlement. She kept this letter as insurance, intending to post it only if her theft was discovered. A desperate measure, but we shall return to that. Miss Hale's eyes remained fixed on the carpet. That same morning, Lionel Brooke visited Dr. Elwood at his surgery. He asked about poisons that might mimic natural death. Why? Because he had received information from a private investigator confirming that money had been systematically stolen from client accounts. He suspected Miss Hale. He scheduled a meeting with her at 4:30 that afternoon, the notation P.H. in his calendar. "I've already explained," Miss Hale began, but Poirot raised his hand. "Please, mademoiselle. Your turn will come. Now consider the afternoon. At 4:10, Miss Hale brought tea to the study. She did not poison it, this I state with certainty. She left immediately for her errands. The tea sat on the tray, waiting for Brooke to pour and drink it." Gerald shifted his weight. "Then who poisoned it, if Miss Hale didn't, and she was the only one who entered the study?" "Ah, but that is where you are wrong, monsieur. She was not the only one." Poirot's eyes moved to Dr. Elwood. "You, Doctor, you returned to Brooke House that afternoon, did you not?" The doctor's face flushed. "I most certainly did not. I told you I was attending patients until evening." "Yet your motor car was seen on the lane behind this house at approximately 4:15. The gardener from the neighbouring property noticed it as he was leaving for the day. He mentioned this to the local constable only this morning." Elwood's jaw tightened. "The gardener is mistaken. Many motor cars use that lane." "Few with the distinctive mud guard of your vehicle, damaged, I am told, in a recent accident." "The same accident, perhaps, that killed the private investigator Lionel Brooke had hired?" The silence that fell over the room had weight and texture. "You're suggesting I killed that investigator?" Elwood's voice rose. "On what possible grounds?" "Because he had discovered the truth. Not about Miss Hale's petty thefts. No, something far more significant. You see, Doctor, you were Lionel Brooke's closest friend. You had access to his office, to his files, to his knowledge of client affairs, and you, not Miss Hale, had been stealing from the trust accounts for years." Mrs. Brooke gasped. Gerald took a step forward, then stopped. Poirot continued, his voice relentless. "Miss Hale kept meticulous records. The books balanced perfectly, too perfectly. But the investigator noticed something curious. Large sums were occasionally transferred between accounts for what appeared to be legitimate investment purposes. These transfers required dual authorization, Brooke's signature and that of a trustee. In several cases, that trustee was you, Doctor, the medical advisor for estates, the trusted friend who witnessed documents. This is absurd. Those transfers were all legitimate. Some were, but others were not. Small amounts diverted here and there over many years, accumulating into quite a substantial fortune. When the investigator began asking questions about certain transactions, you arranged his unfortunate accident. When Brooke himself started reviewing the accounts, you realized he would inevitably discover your theft." Elwood's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady. "Pure speculation. You have no proof." "On the contrary, Doctor, I have the servants' passage." Poirot turned to address the room. "You see, when Miss Hale collected the tea that afternoon, she noticed the door to the back stairs stood ajar. Most curious, as it was usually kept closed. Someone had used those stairs to descend from the upper floors without being observed." "I was never in that passage," Elwood said. "No, yet your pocket watch was found on the floor of the servants' passage this morning by the housemaid. She brought it to Mrs. Brooke, who recognized it immediately. You claimed to have lost it 3 days ago, but the watch stopped at precisely 4:23. Dropped, I suspect, as you waited in the shadows for Miss Hale to depart. Poirot's gaze held the doctor like a pin through a butterfly. You parked your motor car in the lane behind the house, entered through the kitchen door, whilst Mrs. Dockery was in the pantry. You concealed yourself in the servants' passage, waiting until Miss Hale had delivered the tea and left. Then you entered the study, found Brooke at his desk with the tea tray beside him. Perhaps you spoke briefly, perhaps you made some pretense of checking his health, but at some moment you added the poison to the teapot. The teapot was already poisoned when Miss Hale brought it. Elwood protested. No, doctor, the poison was in the pot, not the cup. Had Miss Hale poisoned it in the kitchen, traces would have appeared throughout the liquid, but the laboratory analysis shows concentration at the bottom of the pot, where it would settle if added after the tea had already been poured into it, and the pot was being refilled. You added the poison after Brooke had poured his first cup. He poured a second cup a few minutes later, and that second cup contained the fatal dose. Elwood's hands gripped the arms of his chair. This is fantasy. Why would I kill my oldest friend? Because he had scheduled a meeting with Miss Hale for 4:30. A meeting at which he would confront her with evidence of embezzlement, evidence that might lead him to examine all transactions more closely, including yours. You could not allow that meeting to occur. So you ensured Brooke died first, in a manner that would appear natural. No investigation, no discovery, no exposure. But the letter, Gerald's voice cut through the tension. The letter claiming murder. If the doctor wanted it to appear natural, why would that letter exist? Ah, but he did not write the letter. Miss Hale wrote it weeks earlier for her own purposes. When she posted it after finding Brooke dead, she unwittingly condemned herself as a suspect whilst saving the doctor from suspicion. The letter was meant to point to murder, yes, but murder by anyone except the person who actually committed it. Poirot moved closer to Elwood. You made one error, doctor, one small mistake. When you added the poison to the teapot, you disturbed the tea leaves. An attentive observer might have noticed they were freshly agitated when the pot should have been sitting untouched for several minutes. That is why you lingered after declaring Brooke dead. You insisted on examining the teapot, claiming you needed to check if medication had been mixed with the tea. In truth, you washed out the pot yourself, destroying the evidence of your interference. No one can prove any of this. Your pocket watch proves you were in the servants' passage. The gardener proves your motor car was here. The pattern of the poison proves it was added after the initial pouring. And the investigator's files, which I obtained from his office this afternoon, prove you authorized fraudulent transfers totaling over £15,000 across 5 years. Poirot's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. You killed 2 men to protect your theft, doctor, and you very nearly succeeded. Elwood sat motionless, his face grey as ash. Then, with a movement that seemed to drain his remaining strength, he slumped forward in his chair. Lionel suspected. That morning, when he came to my surgery asking about poisons, he didn't say so directly, but I saw it in his eyes. He knew. The confession came like water through a cracked dam. I never meant for it to go so far. The first transfers were small. I told myself I would repay them. But then there was my son's debts, then the surgery needed repairs, then... He raised his head. The investigator was an accident. I swear to you, an accident. But Lionel would have destroyed me, my reputation, my practice, everything. So you destroyed him instead, Poirot said quietly. Inspector Marsh moved forward, but Elwood raised no objection as the handcuffs closed around his wrist. He walked from the room with the slow gait of a man who had aged decades in minutes. In the silence that followed, Mrs. Brooke wept into her hands while Gerald stood frozen by the fireplace. Miss Hale rose and walked to the window, her reflection ghostly in the darkening glass. Poirot crossed to where I stood by the door. "Come, Hastings, our work here is finished. Let them grieve in privacy." As we walked through the autumn night toward the inn, the question that had troubled me throughout burst forth. "The letter, Poirot, that damnable letter! How could a dead man—" "He could not, mon ami, that is the point. The letter came from the living, from Miss Hale's paranoia and desperation. It was never Brooke's message from beyond death, but a thief's clumsy attempt at self-preservation that accidentally exposed a killer. The stars emerged above us cold and distant. Justice had been served, but at what cost I could not measure. Epilogue. We departed Wetherby-on-Avon on the morning train, leaving behind a household fractured by betrayal. Inspector Marsh had taken Dr. Elwood into custody the previous evening, and by breakfast the town had begun to whisper the story that would occupy its conversations for months to come. Poirot sat across from me in the railway carriage, his gaze fixed on the passing countryside. The silence between us held none of its usual companionship. At length I ventured the question that had occupied my thoughts since we left Brooke House. "Miss Hale, what will become of her?" "She has made full restitution of the money she stole. Mrs. Brooke has agreed not to press charges, though I suspect Miss Hale will find employment difficult to secure." Poirot's expression remained thoughtful. "Her theft was wrong, certainly, but in a curious way her very guilt saved her. Had she not written that letter in her paranoia, had she not posted it in her panic, Elwood's crime might have passed unnoticed." "A dead man solving his own murder," I said, "though in truth the dead man never wrote the letter at all." "Précisément, Hastings, and therein lies the irony most profound. Colonel Brooke suspected theft. He scheduled a confrontation. He even asked his doctor about poisons, a question that sealed his fate, for it revealed to Elwood that discovery loomed. But Brooke never anticipated murder, never wrote that warning letter. He died believing his methodical investigation would expose a thief. He could not know it would expose a killer. Yet the letter claimed, 'If you are reading this, then I have been murdered.'" "Yes." Miss Hale composed those words to protect herself from suspicion should Brooke die unexpectedly. She imagined a scenario where someone else might kill him and she would be blamed. Her fear created a fiction that became, by terrible accident, fact. Poirot shook his head. She wrote of murder, and murder there was, simply not the murder she imagined. And Elwood believed the death would pass as natural. He had every reason for such confidence. He was the attending physician. He certified the death. Without that letter drawing attention to the impossibility of its own existence, without the laboratory examination it prompted, the poison would never have been discovered. Poirot's fingers formed a precise triangle beneath his chin. "The letter was a lie that told the truth, mon ami, a forgery that achieved what the genuine article could not." The train carried us through fields where morning mist clung to hollows, like ghostly reminders of what had passed. I thought of Mrs. Brooke's tears, of Gerald's stunned silence, of the house that would forever bear the weight of its secrets. "A trusted friend," I said, "a man who sat at their table, who attended their ailments, who was welcomed as family. To betray that trust with theft, and then with murder. The human capacity for self-deception is infinite, Hastings." Elwood convinced himself that each small theft was justified, that each betrayal could be rationalized. By the time murder became necessary, he had already travelled so far down that path that one more step seemed inevitable. Poirot gazed out the window. "That is perhaps the greatest danger of all, not the single great crime, but but the accumulation of small compromises that lead a man to believe he has no choice but to kill. We lapsed into silence as London emerged from the distance, its smoke and noise a return to the familiar. The case of Lionel Brooke and his impossible letter would be filed away, another story of human weakness and its consequences. Yet as we pulled into the station and gathered our belongings, I found myself thinking not of the killer or his victim, but of a desperate woman who had written a letter she hoped would never be sent, and in sending it had given voice to a dead man who never spoke. Some truths, it seemed, required lies to bring them into the light. Poirot, as though reading my thoughts, murmured as we stepped onto the platform. In the end, Hastings, justice came not from Lionel Brooke's warning, but from his silence. The silence that made Miss Hale's letter an impossibility, and impossibilities are what lead the detective to truth. He adjusted his hat with his customary precision, and we walked out into the London morning, leaving the dead to their rest and the living to their reckonings. Thank you for listening to A Letter from the Dead here on Cafe Stories. This case reminds us that sometimes the most powerful clue is not what was said, but what was never meant to be sent. A forged letter, written in fear, became the very thing that exposed a calculated killer. In the end, it was not a message from beyond the grave, but a lie that revealed the truth. If you enjoyed this cinematic approach to the story, I would genuinely love your thoughts in the comments. Your feedback shapes what comes next. Until next time, stay observant, stay thoughtful, and may your evenings always be filled with good stories and warm company. This is Alfie, signing off from Cafe Stories.